I had never been a fan of the quiet, but that night it was all there was. A quiet so deep you could feel it pressing against your chest, your head, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I had always been one to crave noise, the hum of life around me, but that night in the middle of nowhere, even the wind seemed to stay still. It was just supposed to be a routine check, the kind of thing a person does when they're looking to clear their head, when they need to get away from the clutter of life. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. That was my mistake. Nothing ever happens when you expect it least, right? The truck's engine rumbled beneath me as I drove down that old gravel road. I knew it well, or so I thought. I'd been through these woods plenty of times before. The endless stretches of pine trees lining the sides of the road, the occasional clearing where the grass grew wild and untamed, the distant mountain ridges that barely peeked out through the fog. This place was secluded, sure, but that was why I liked it. It offered a sense of peace, like I was in a world that didn't need anything from me. I passed the old trail marker, a rusted sign that had seen better days. The paint was chipped, the edges bent from years of weather, but it still stood firm, guiding those brave or foolish enough to venture into the wilderness. I turned the wheel slightly, the tires crunching over the gravel as I followed the narrow path deeper into the trees. The air had that damp, earthy smell to it, a mix of wet soil and decaying leaves. There was a slight mist creeping over the ground, the fog clinging to the trees like ghosts, though I wouldn't have called them that, just nature doing its thing. I rolled the window down slightly, letting the cool air brush against my face. The sky was overcast, dark clouds hanging heavy above, and I couldn't help but feel like the weather was mirroring my mood. There was a heaviness in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I'd been driving for about 20 minutes when I saw it. A cabin, tucked away at the edge of a small clearing. It was old, built long before I was born, the kind of structure that had weathered the years but didn't seem to be getting any stronger for it. The wood was weather-beaten, a deep brownish gray, and the roof looked like it had been patched up more times than I could count. The windows were mostly boarded up, save for one that had a single cracked pane. I didn't think much of it at first, just a cabin, nothing more, but something about it felt wrong, out of place, like it didn't belong. I slowed down as I approached, my foot easing off the gas pedal. The truck rolled to a stop just outside the clearing, the engine ticking in the cold air. I stared at the cabin for a long moment, an unsettling feeling crawling up my spine. It was quiet, too quiet. I told myself it was nothing, the kind of feeling you get when you've been on your own for too long, when the isolation starts to play tricks on your mind. But something in the pit of my stomach told me to stay alert. So I did what anyone else would do in a moment of doubt. I stayed in the truck and checked my phone. No signal. Of course, I wasn't surprised, but it didn't help the unease gnawing at me. I sat there for a while, the engine running, the cabin still in my peripheral vision. The wind picked up then, rustling the trees, but still, everything remained eerily silent. It was almost as if the world had stopped moving, just waiting for something. I considered leaving, turning around and heading back to the safety of familiar roads. But curiosity got the best of me. I didn't need to go inside the cabin. I told myself I just needed to take a look, see if anyone was around. I shut off the engine, grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment, and stepped out of the truck. The gravel crunched under my boots as I made my way to the cabin. The air was cold now, a chill that seeped into my skin as I walked, the kind of cold that made you feel like it was more than just the temperature, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the earth. I tried not to think about it. The cabin was closer now, and I could see more details. The door was cracked slightly open, the hinges rusted, but still functioning. No sign of anyone inside, but the door being ajar unsettled me. I approached slowly, my boots heavy on the ground, the beam of the flashlight casting long, shifting shadows. As I reached the porch, I noticed something on the steps. It was a small pile of leaves, but they were disturbed, like something had recently been sitting there. Maybe an animal? A bird? It didn't seem important, but the longer I stared at it, the more it bothered me. I couldn't explain why. I knocked on the door, just a light tap, but there was no response. I didn't expect one, really, but I waited for a moment, as if I were hoping someone would appear, maybe just to explain the strange feeling hanging in the air. When nothing happened, I pushed the door open a little more, careful not to disturb the fragile hinges. The interior was dark, dust floating in the beams of the flashlight. I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and old wood, the kind of smell you get when something's been left to rot in the dark for too long. The floor creaked underfoot as I moved deeper into the room, my flashlight sweeping over old furniture. An armchair, a small wooden table, a rusted potbelly stove. It looked abandoned, though it had that unsettlingly lived-in feel, like someone had just stepped out, leaving everything in its place. I took another step and froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was the smallest sound, barely perceptible, but I could have sworn I heard something. A scraping noise, almost like fingernails on wood, came from the far corner of the room. I waited. My heart beat faster now, my breath shallow. There was something else in here with me. I wasn't alone. I turned the flashlight in that direction, but all I saw was the dark corner of the room. Empty. Nothing. But the sound had been real. I wasn't imagining it. I stayed where I was for a long time, listening. The silence pressed in from all sides, thick and heavy. I glanced around, unsure of what to do next. There was no way to know if anyone else was in the cabin. There wasn't even a sign of anyone having been there recently. I moved to the far wall, my eyes scanning every shadow, every dark space in the room. And then I saw it. A small door, tucked in the corner behind the stove. It was half hidden, the handle worn smooth from years of use. It was a cellar, I realized, and for some reason, the thought of it made my stomach twist. I knew I should leave. I had no business being here, but that damn curiosity, the thing I had no control over, it drove me forward. I couldn't stop myself. I approached the door slowly, reaching for the handle. My fingers wrapped around the cold metal, and with a deep breath, I turned it. The door creaked open, the hinges protesting against the weight of time. What I saw next made everything in me freeze. The cellar was not empty. There, in the far corner, hunched over and shivering, was a man. His face was gaunt, his skin pale, eyes wide and wild with terror. He was dirty, ragged, his clothes torn and stained. And the worst part? He was staring directly at me. His eyes filled with a kind of primal fear that I couldn't quite place. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as if we were both frozen in place, unsure of what the other would do. Then, in the space of a second, I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't care to. I bolted from the cabin, heart pounding in my chest, my footsteps pounding in my ears. I didn't stop running until I reached the truck. And when I looked back at the cabin one last time, I saw something. A figure, standing just inside the doorway, watching me. Not the man from the cellar. Something else. Something darker. I didn't stop driving until I was back on the main road. The gravel under my tires a comforting sound as I sped away. I never went back. Never even told anyone what I saw that day. But every time I pass that stretch of road, I can't help but glance toward that clearing, wondering if that cabin is still there, still waiting, still hiding its secrets in the shadows. I had always thought I'd spend my retirement quietly, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. After spending 35 years working as a mechanic in a small town, I wanted something different, something simpler. So, I bought a small cabin on the outskirts of nowhere, tucked deep in the woods. The land was cheap, and the seclusion was exactly what I was looking for. No neighbors for miles, no busy roads, just trees, dirt paths, and the occasional rustle of wildlife. I figured I'd spend my days tinkering with old cars, working on the place, maybe even doing some hunting or fishing if I felt like it. It was supposed to be peaceful. First, everything was perfect. I didn't have to talk to anyone if I didn't want to. I woke up to the sound of birds and the wind rustling the trees. The smell of pine was thick in the air. The nights were quiet, with only the occasional howl of a distant coyote. It was what I had imagined when I bought the place. Just me, nature, and a world that didn't seem to care much about anything. But after a few months, things started to feel different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first. It was subtle, a strange feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the silence at night, or the way the wind seemed to pick up at the oddest hours. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me after years of living in a town with constant noise and activity. But every now and then, as I sat on the porch in the evening, sipping coffee and staring out into the woods, I'd catch a glimpse of movement at the edge of my vision. Something far off, just beyond the trees. When I turned my head, it was always gone. It wasn't the animals. I'd gotten used to them, deer, raccoons, squirrels, even the occasional fox. But this wasn't the same. It was something else, something human. I brushed it off, told myself I was being paranoid. After all, I had spent most of my life working in a small town where everyone knew everyone. It was hard to shake off that sense of community, even if I had moved to the middle of nowhere. It was probably just the weird way the trees moved, or maybe the wind playing tricks on me. That was until I started finding things out of place. It was a Tuesday afternoon, just like any other. I had been working on an old truck I had found in town. A real piece of junk, but I loved bringing things back to life. The sun was dipping low in the sky when I went to grab my tools from the shed out back. I'd left them inside, but when I opened the door, something felt wrong. My heart started racing. The shed was locked. I always kept it locked, but it was wide open now. My tools were scattered all over the floor, some of them tossed aside, others missing entirely. A wrench I had just used was nowhere to be found, and I could have sworn I left it on the workbench. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, checking every corner. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, other than the mess. I thought maybe it was just the wind, maybe a raccoon or some other animal had gotten in. I cleaned up and locked the door again, but the uneasy feeling lingered. That night, as I sat by the fire inside my cabin, I couldn't shake the thought that someone had been in my shed. I kept looking out the window, into the woods, as if expecting to see someone standing just beyond the trees, watching me. But there was nothing. The next morning, I found footprints outside the shed. Not animal tracks, but human-sized. They led up to the shed, then disappeared into the woods. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't recognize them. They weren't my boots, and they didn't belong to anyone in the nearby town. There was no one who lived close enough to be making the trek through the woods. I was alone. I tried to dismiss it as nothing. Maybe someone had passed through the area. Maybe it was just a hunter or a lost traveler. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. There was something off about those prints, something about the way they disappeared without a trace. The next few days passed without incident, but the unease never left. Every time I left the cabin, I found myself looking over my shoulder, as if expecting someone to be following me. I started locking the doors at night, even though it felt ridiculous. It's just me out here. There's nobody for miles. Then one night, it happened again. I woke up to the sound of something scratching at the door. Soft at first, then louder, like something trying to claw its way in. My heart raced as I lay perfectly still, listening. The scratching stopped, then started again, this time at the window. I couldn't see anything outside, but I knew something was there. It wasn't an animal. Animals don't scratch windows in the middle of the night. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept to the window, shining it out into the dark. The beam of light cut through the darkness, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure moving just beyond the trees. It was tall, thin, and seemed to blend into the shadows, but it wasn't an animal. I couldn't see any details, but I could feel its presence. The flashlight flickered. I thought my heart might stop. I quickly pulled away from the window and grabbed the rifle I kept by the door, my hands shaking as I loaded it. I knew I had to stay calm, but it was hard. I stayed up the rest of the night, my back pressed against the wall, the rifle in my hands. Every creak of the cabin felt like it was louder than it should be. Every gust of wind felt like someone was out there, just waiting. The next day, I didn't find any signs of anyone being around. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. It was as if whoever or whatever had been out there the night before had vanished. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Something was out there, watching. Days turned into weeks, and I kept telling myself it was all in my head. But every little noise, every slight movement in the trees, every time I thought I saw something on the edge of my vision, it all added up. It was getting worse. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone or something was out there. One morning, I decided to take action. I couldn't keep living like this, not knowing. I had to find out who or what was stalking me. I packed a bag, grabbed my rifle, and headed into the woods. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I was determined to find something, anything. I hiked for hours, deeper into the forest than I had ever gone. The trees were thick and the air was damp. It was quiet, too quiet. I didn't hear a single bird, not even the sound of insects buzzing. It was like the whole world had gone still. As I walked, I noticed signs, small things. A snapped twig here, a footprint there. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I was on the right track. Eventually, I came to a clearing. It was the strangest thing. There was a small, abandoned shack in the center. It was old, the wood was rotting, and the roof had caved in places. But it was still standing. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Something wasn't right here. I slowly pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the still air. Inside, it was dark, but I could make out the faint outline of old furniture. Broken chairs, a rusty stove, and something in the corner that I couldn't quite make out. My flashlight flickered as I moved further inside, scanning the room. And then I saw it, a pile of old clothes stacked neatly in the corner. My stomach churned. The clothes looked fresh, like someone had been living here recently. The air grew thick, heavy with the feeling that I wasn't alone. Couldn't breathe. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a rustle of leaves. I whipped around, rifle raised, but there was nothing. Nothing but the trees and the silence. I backed out of the shack, my legs shaking. Something was wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I turned and hurried back the way I came. I didn't know who or what was out there, but I knew one thing. It wasn't just some random person passing through. This was deliberate. Someone was watching me, tracking me, and they had been for a long time. I made it back to the cabin that evening, my mind racing. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, staring out the windows, waiting for the sound of footsteps in the woods. But the night was quiet, too quiet. There was no scratching, no movement, only the wind. The next morning, I packed my things. I wasn't going to wait around any longer. I didn't know who had been out there or why they had been watching me, but I was done. It wasn't worth the risk. I sold the cabin, left the land behind, and never looked back. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still out there, watching me from the trees. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of relief. Whatever had been waiting for me in those woods wasn't my problem anymore. I was free. The woods were silent once more. It was a clear, crisp evening in late autumn, and I had just finished another long day at work. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary when I left the office. The air had a slight chill to it, and the leaves were beginning to turn their vibrant reds and yellows. I got in my truck and drove down the empty highway, the sort that stretched on for miles without a single light, just the dark landscape stretching out in front of me. The drive to my cousin's place was long, a good few hours from the nearest town, but it was always a quiet, peaceful drive. He lived deep in the woods, far from the nearest neighbor, an old farmhouse passed down through the family. It was a place for solitude, something I always appreciated when I needed to clear my head. As the miles rolled on, the light from the setting sun faded into a thick darkness. The headlights of my truck cut through the black, but beyond the beam of light, everything was obscured. The radio crackled with static, and I adjusted the dial, trying to find a station. It was one of those drives that felt like it would go on forever, the monotonous road stretching ahead, with the occasional turn or bump that brought me back to reality. At some point, the pavement turned to gravel, and I knew I was getting closer. The road twisted through the trees, the towering pine trees blocking out any trace of moonlight. There was something about the woods at night that always felt off, an eerie stillness that you couldn't quite explain. You wouldn't hear anything except the sound of your own breath and the occasional scurrying of wildlife in the underbrush. It was peaceful but unsettling at the same time. The house came into view just as I rounded a sharp curve. It was a large, two-story farmhouse, its silhouette dark against the sky. The porch light was on, casting a faint glow onto the gravel driveway. I pulled up and parked next to my cousin's truck, which was already there. The door opened before I even had a chance to knock, and I saw Greg standing in the doorway with a wide grin on his face. "You made it," he said, his voice booming in the quiet night. "I thought you were gonna get lost out there." I smiled and nodded, stepping inside. Greg had always been the outgoing one, the type who could charm just about anyone. He had a good sense of humor, always cracking jokes. But there was something about him tonight that felt different. A kind of restlessness in his eyes, like he was waiting for something. "You hungry?" he asked as he led me into the kitchen, where the smell of something savory filled the air. I nodded, sitting at the table as he went over to the stove. We spent the next hour catching up. It had been months since we last saw each other, and the conversation flowed easily, just like it always did. But even as we talked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was a sense of unease that lingered in the air. Greg kept glancing out the window, as if expecting someone or something. I didn't mention it, but I could tell he was on edge. After dinner, Greg suggested we go for a walk in the woods. He said he liked to clear his mind at night, walking through the trees and listening to the sounds of the forest. I didn't see the harm in it, so I agreed. We grabbed a couple of flashlights and headed out the back door, stepping into the cool night air. The woods around the house were dense, the trees so close together that the path between them barely allowed us to pass. As we walked, I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every small sound seemed amplified in the quiet of the forest. The crunch of leaves beneath our boots felt too loud, and the wind rustled the branches above us, sending a chill down my spine. I glanced at Greg, but he seemed unfazed, his eyes scanning the woods like he was looking for something. "This place is beautiful at night," Greg said, his voice almost a whisper. "But you get used to the quiet out here. Sometimes, it feels like the woods are alive." I laughed, trying to shake off the unease, but his words hung in the air. The silence of the woods felt thick, suffocating, and I couldn't help but feel that something was lurking just beyond the trees, watching us. We continued walking, the beam of our flashlights cutting through the darkness. We didn't speak much after that. The further we went, the more the air seemed to thicken, pressing in on me. It felt like the woods were closing in around us, trapping us in some way I couldn't explain. At some point, Greg stopped and held up his hand, signaling for me to be quiet. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't hear anything, but I could feel it. An unnatural stillness, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I looked at Greg, but he was staring into the distance, his face pale. "We're not alone," he said softly. I felt my heart skip a beat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer, just motioned for me to follow. He moved quickly, his footsteps light as he weaved through the trees, and I struggled to keep up. I wanted to call out, to ask what was going on, but I couldn't find the words. The further we went, the more oppressive the air became, like we were being pulled deeper into the forest. Then I heard it, a faint crack of a branch snapping, followed by another. Something or someone was moving through the trees behind us. Greg stopped again, his flashlight flickering. He turned to me, his face grim. "Don't look back," he whispered, but I couldn't help myself. My body reacted before I could stop it. I turned my head, just a little, and in the distance, between the trees, I saw something. Someone. A figure just standing there, motionless, watching us. My heart hammered in my chest, and I turned back to Greg, but he was already moving again, faster this time. I followed, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my mind racing with panic. We ran through the forest, the sounds of footsteps behind us growing louder. It was as if whatever was following us was gaining on us. We stumbled back toward the house, the trees thinning out as we approached the clearing. I thought we were almost there, that we were safe, but then I heard a voice. It was faint at first, like it was coming from far away, but it was unmistakable. "Greg." It was my name, but it wasn't Greg's voice. It was a low, gravelly voice, echoing in the stillness of the night. I looked around frantically, my pulse racing. "Greg, what is that?" Greg's face had gone white, his mouth pressed into a tight line. "Don't answer it," he said, his voice trembling. "Keep moving." We reached the house, and Greg slammed the door shut behind us, locking it quickly. We stood there, breathing heavily, trying to collect ourselves. The sound of the forest was muffled now, but there was still an eerie stillness outside, like everything had gone quiet. We didn't sleep that night. The silence outside the house was deafening, and every now and then, I thought I heard something tapping on the windows, just out of sight. By morning, the sun had risen, but the fear from the night before hadn't left. I was ready to leave, to get as far away from that place as possible. Greg, however, wouldn't talk about it. He just acted like nothing had happened, as if the events of the previous night were nothing more than a bad dream. I left the house that morning, driving away without looking back. I still don't know what happened that night, but I've never been back to that house. The woods, the quiet, the feeling of being watched, those things linger in my mind. I don't know who or what was following us, but I'm sure of one thing: it wasn't human. I was driving through the middle of nowhere when I first saw the man. It was late, past midnight, and I had been on the road for hours. I was heading west, cutting through a stretch of back roads that barely counted as highways, trying to make good time. My tank was half full, my headlights stretched out into the dark, and my only company was the distant hum of the engine and the occasional flicker of a road sign warning of deer. There was nothing else, no streetlights, no houses, no gas stations. Just an endless stretch of pavement cutting through the emptiness. I hadn't seen another car in miles. Then I saw him. At first, I thought he was a deer, just another shape on the side of the road. But as I got closer, I realized it was a man, standing near the edge of the highway, just beyond the reach of my headlights. He was still unmoving, not hitchhiking, not waving for help, just standing there. Something about him didn't sit right. Most people, if they were stranded, would try to flag someone down, or they'd be on their phone calling for help. But this guy, he wasn't doing any of that. He was just standing there, still as a statue, watching the road, watching me. I gripped the wheel and kept driving. I passed him quickly, my headlights washing over him for just a second before he disappeared into the dark behind me. I only got a brief look, tall, thin, dark clothes, but no real details. His face was just a blur, turned slightly away from the light. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I just kept driving. A few minutes passed, and I tried to shake the feeling that had settled over me. It was nothing, just some guy. Maybe his car broke down. Maybe he was waiting for someone to pick him up. There were a dozen logical explanations, but something about the way he was standing there, just watching, had put a bad feeling in my gut. I shook it off and kept going. Then I saw the second man, farther up the road, standing the same way, still motionless, just beyond the reach of my headlights. Same dark clothes, same thin frame, same eerie, unnatural stillness. I felt my chest tighten. I passed him the same way I had the first one, my hands gripping the wheel tight. This time, I tried to get a better look at his face, but I still couldn't make out any details. He was just a shape, just a dark figure against the empty backdrop of the highway. I checked my rearview mirror, half expecting him to turn and start walking toward my car, but he didn't move. Neither had the first one. I kept driving. The next time I saw one, I was ready for it. He appeared just like the others, standing perfectly still at the edge of the road, waiting. This time, my heart was pounding. I kept my foot steady on the gas, trying not to look directly at him. But as I passed, I noticed something. They weren't the same man, but they all looked similar. Same height, same build, same clothes. It wasn't normal. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew I didn't want to stop to find out. I kept going, trying to put as much distance between me and them as I could. The road stretched out ahead, endless and dark, and I just focused on the horizon, on the distant thought of a gas station, a town, anything. Then my headlights caught something in the road. I slammed on the brakes. A car was stopped in the middle of the highway, its hazard lights flashing dimly. The front end was smashed in, the windshield shattered. The driver's door was open. It looked like a wreck. I slowed down, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Something was wrong.
No skid marks. No debris.
The wreck looked staged. Then I saw the figure standing next to the car. Not on the side of the road this time. Not standing still. This one was closer, moving. I didn't wait. I slammed my foot on the gas, swerving around the car. The tires skidded against the pavement as I tore past it, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I kept going. The road twisted and turned through the dark, the trees closing in on either side. I checked my mirror again. Nothing. No figures.
No flashing lights.
Just empty road stretching behind me. I kept driving, my fingers clenched tight around the wheel, waiting for the next one, waiting for something worse. But I didn't see any more figures, not for a long time. Eventually, a gas station appeared on the horizon, a lone building sitting in the dark like an island in an empty sea. The lights were harsh and fluorescent, flickering slightly. I pulled in and sat in my car for a moment, my breath finally catching up with me. I wasn't sure what I had just driven through. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I got out, stretched my legs, and filled my tank. The clerk inside barely looked up as I paid. I didn't mention what I had seen. What would I even say? As I got back in my car, I glanced at the road behind me. It was empty. The figures were gone. But that didn't mean they weren't still out there. I had always liked being alone in the wilderness. Something about the silence, the way the air smelled cleaner, the way I could hear every little sound, the rustling of leaves, the crunch of twigs under my boots, the distant call of some bird I couldn't name. It was peaceful. It was simple. It was the only place that ever really made sense to me. That's why I was out there that weekend, deep in the backcountry of Utah, miles from anything. I had driven as far as my truck would take me down a dirt road that barely counted as a road, then hiked another 6 miles on foot. No trails, no markers, no signs of human life. Just me, my pack, and the trees. I had brought a rifle, not because I was expecting trouble, but because I knew better than to be out in the middle of nowhere without one. You don't go unarmed into the wild. That was something my dad had drilled into my head as a kid. It wasn't just the animals you had to worry about, it was people too. The first night was quiet. I built a small fire, ate a simple meal of jerky and trail mix, and settled into my tent early. The wind whispered through the trees, and the stars stretched endlessly overhead. It was the kind of night that reminded me why I came out here in the first place. The second night was when things changed. I had spent the day exploring the area, following a creek that wound through the valley, filling my water bottles, and just enjoying the solitude. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was already sinking behind the mountains. I set up a small fire again, ate, and got ready to turn in for the night. Then I heard it, a sound in the distance. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a coyote or a deer moving through the brush. But then I heard it again, closer. It wasn't an animal. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the trees to my right. I froze, listening. The fire crackled beside me, casting flickering shadows on the ground. My rifle was within arm's reach, but I didn't grab it. Not yet. I just sat there, staring into the darkness, waiting. The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched. Then, from somewhere just beyond the edge of the firelight, I heard something that made my skin crawl. It was my own voice, not an echo, not my own breathing or the wind carrying a distorted sound. It was my voice, just one word. Hello. It was soft, just loud enough to hear. I felt my stomach twist. My hand tightened around my rifle. I didn't say that. I didn't say anything. And yet, I had heard my own voice, clear as day, coming from the trees. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then, from a little farther to the left, I heard it again. Hello. Exactly the same. My voice, but not me. I grabbed my rifle, stood up slowly, and aimed it toward the trees. I didn't fire. I didn't even raise the barrel fully. I just held it, ready. Then something stepped into the firelight. It looked like a man, tall, thin, dressed in tattered, dirty clothes. His skin was pale, almost gray in the flickering light. His hair hung in uneven clumps around his face. And his eyes were wrong. Too dark, too deep, like they weren't really eyes at all, just empty holes. I didn't say anything. I just stood there watching. He opened his mouth, and then, in my voice, he spoke again. Hello. The exact same tone, the same inflection, the same everything. My finger tensed on the trigger. Then he moved, not like a person, not like anything I had ever seen before. His arms jerked first, too fast, too sharp. Then his legs followed, bending in a way that made my stomach lurch. He twitched, shifted, then took a step closer. I backed away, rifle raised. Then he smiled. His teeth were wrong. Too many, too sharp, too uneven, like they had been shoved into his mouth at random. I took another step back. He took another step forward. Then he tilted his head, just slightly, like he was listening for something. And then he whispered something, not in my voice, in my mother's. Just one word. My name. I don't remember making the decision to fire. My body acted before my mind caught up. The shot rang out, echoing through the trees. He jerked back, stumbled, and for a split second, I thought I had hit him. Then he started laughing. It was wrong. Choked, wheezing, like he had never laughed before and didn't understand how. Then he moved, faster than anything should move. I turned and ran. I don't remember grabbing my pack, but I must have, because when I finally stopped running, I still had it slung over my shoulder. I ran blindly, crashing through the trees, not caring about the noise, not caring about anything except getting away. I didn't stop until I physically couldn't run anymore. I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath, rifle still clutched in my hands. The forest was silent, too silent. No wind, no insects, no distant calls of animals. Just empty, suffocating quiet. Then, from somewhere far too close, I heard it again. My name, not in my mother's voice this time, in my father's. I ran again. I don't know how long. It felt like hours. The trees blurred past me. My legs ached. My lungs burned. I tripped, fell, got back up, kept going. Somehow, I found my way back to my truck. The moment I saw it, I almost collapsed in relief. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking so bad I could barely get the door open. Then, just as I was about to climb inside, I heard something, not behind me, not in the trees, from the passenger seat. Soft, mocking, my voice. Hello. I didn't look. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and turned the engine over so fast I nearly flooded it. Then I floored it. I didn't stop driving until the sun was high in the sky. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't know what followed me, but I do know one thing. I'm never going back. It was late October when I took the job. The kind of cold that bites at your fingertips had started to creep in, but the ground hadn't frozen yet. The leaves had turned, but most of them were still on the trees, dry and curled, shaking in the wind. The job itself wasn't much, just a routine delivery for a small company I had been working with on and off. They needed a shipment dropped off at a construction site way out in the middle of nowhere. Some new build, a private contract for a wealthy client who wanted their mansion or hunting lodge or whatever it was to be deep in the woods, far from everything. I didn't ask many questions. It was decent money, and I had done similar runs before. I was given a pickup truck with a covered bed, loaded up with boxes of supplies, tools, hardware, stuff that could probably wait a few days, but the client wanted it there now. I checked the fuel, made sure I had everything I needed, and started the drive. The first few hours were easy. Highways, then back roads, then rougher, narrower paths that wound through thick forest. By the time I passed the last real sign of civilization, a gas station that looked abandoned even though it wasn't, I had nothing ahead but miles of dirt and gravel roads. The site was at least 2 more hours ahead, and the sun was already low. The GPS had lost service miles back, and I was working off printed directions given to me by the company. I followed them carefully, checking each turn, counting miles in my head. Somewhere along the way, I realized I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. No headlights behind me, no signs of people. Just trees, endless trees, pressing in on both sides of the road. It got darker fast. The road narrowed even more, twisting and rough. I slowed down, watching carefully for the turn I needed. The truck's headlights cut through the trees, but beyond them, everything was black. Then I saw the split in the road. The left side continued straight, but the right, the path I was supposed to take, looked less traveled. Less like a road and more like a trail cut through the woods. My instructions said this was the way, so I turned. Immediately, the surface changed. Gravel turned to packed dirt, and the truck rocked with the uneven ground. I eased my foot off the gas, letting it roll forward, keeping an eye on the deep grooves carved by past vehicles. The further I went, the worse it got. The trees crowded closer, and the ground was littered with fallen branches, making it a slow, careful drive. I kept glancing at the directions, counting the miles. Then I saw the first sign that something wasn't right. It was small, just a piece of clothing caught on a low-hanging branch. A torn bit of fabric, dirty, fluttering slightly in the wind. Could have been trash, could have been nothing, but it stood out in a place like this. I kept driving. A few minutes later, I saw something else. Tire tracks, deep and uneven, veering off the path. They didn't go far before stopping suddenly, like someone had braked hard or swerved. I glanced around, but there was nothing else. No wreckage, no abandoned car. Just those marks in the dirt, like someone had been here, but left in a hurry. I kept moving. The truck rocked as I hit a rough patch, the suspension groaning. The trees seemed even closer now, branches scratching against the sides of the vehicle. My headlights caught something up ahead, and I instinctively slowed. It was a vehicle, an old, rusted-out pickup, abandoned at an angle just off the road, half buried in fallen leaves. The hood was open, the engine exposed to the elements. The windshield was cracked, a thick layer of dust and dirt covering it. It had been there a while. I drove past slowly, keeping my eyes on it. No signs of anyone, no movement, just an old truck left to rot. Still, something about it made my skin crawl. I pressed on. The road curved sharply, then dipped, the ground uneven. The truck bounced hard, the cargo in the back shifting with a dull thud. I kept my hands tight on the wheel. Then I saw it. In my headlights, just ahead, a figure stood in the middle of the road. A man. He was still, facing me directly, his arms hanging loose at his sides. His clothes were dark, worn, blending into the night. I hit the brakes hard. The truck skidded slightly before stopping, my headlights flooding over him. He didn't move. I waited. A second passed, then another. He was just standing there. I felt my pulse hammering in my chest. I had seen people hitchhiking, sure. I had seen weird things on back roads. But this was different. This guy wasn't signaling for help. He wasn't moving toward the truck. He was just standing there, staring straight ahead. I wasn't sure what to do. My gut told me to reverse, to turn around, to get the hell out of there. But the road was narrow, and trying to back up through all those twists and rough patches would be risky. I honked the horn. Nothing. He didn't react at all. The longer I sat there, the worse it felt. My headlights made it impossible to see past him into the trees. I didn't know if he was alone. I reached for my phone, but of course no signal. Then he moved. Not fast, just a slow, deliberate step forward. Then another. I didn't wait. I threw the truck into reverse, tires spinning in the loose dirt. The vehicle rocked as I backed up fast, the rear tires hitting a deep rut. I glanced forward. He was still walking, same pace, straight toward me. I kept reversing, trying to stay steady. The road was too rough to go fast, but I kept my foot down. Then I saw something in the trees. Another figure. This one barely visible, just a shape in the darkness. Then another. There were more of them. I slammed the gear into drive. I didn't care about the road, didn't care if I wrecked the truck. I just floored it. The man in the road didn't move fast enough. I swerved around him, tires slipping, the truck jolting over the uneven ground. My headlights flashed past the other figures, 3, maybe 4 of them, standing just inside the tree-line. Watching, I didn't look back. I pushed the truck as fast as I could, the engine roaring. The road blurred past, the trees whipping by in the dark. I didn't stop, didn't slow down until I reached the main road again, my hands shaking on the wheel. I drove straight back to town. I didn't stop until I was in a lit parking lot, surrounded by people. I never made that delivery. When I told the company, they didn't ask many questions. They just reassigned the job. I don't know who those people were or what they were doing out there, and I don't want to know. But I never took another job that sent me into the woods alone again. The night was as still as it could possibly get. I remember thinking that there was something unsettling about the way the world seemed to hold its breath in those hours before sunrise. We were deep into the woods, miles from the nearest town, working on a project my boss, Raymond, had been overseeing for months. I wasn't sure why we were here, further away than any reasonable person would want to go. But the project was important to him. It was supposed to be the start of something big. It was all I'd heard about for the past year. New construction, new deals, new clients. Yet here I was in the middle of nowhere, in a place that felt completely disconnected from anything that could be called civilization. The job had started normal enough. We were surveying the land, marking out spaces for future buildings. The company was planning to buy the land and build something impressive: homes, offices, stores, the usual. What exactly? Raymond hadn't been clear. All I knew was that this was his dream project. He was already talking about how this was going to put him on the map. So naturally, I had to tag along. It wasn't like I had much of a choice. Raymond was one of those bosses that liked to bring people out to see the big picture, even when there wasn't much to see. The first couple of days were boring, just trekking through thick, untamed woods, measuring the land, and dealing with the logistics. It was just the two of us out there. But then, as the days went on, something started to feel wrong. At first, it was small things, tripping over roots in places where I was sure I hadn't tripped before. Hearing what I could have sworn were voices in the distance, though there was no one out there. I thought it was nothing at first, just my mind playing tricks. But Raymond started acting weird, too. At first, I thought it was just his usual overzealous personality, but over the next few days, he started becoming more distant. He would stay up late, sketching things on his notepad, muttering to himself. Sometimes I'd hear him whispering things I couldn't quite make out. One night, it got worse. It had started to rain earlier in the evening. A heavy, relentless downpour that turned the roads to mud. We were supposed to head back to the truck, but Raymond insisted on staying a little longer. The rain didn't bother him. Just a little longer, he said, his voice rough, the way it always sounded when he was excited about something. I need to make sure we get this right. It was getting late, and there was no cell reception. No one would come looking for us, and the thought of the storm pressing in around us was making the atmosphere feel thicker, heavier. It was almost suffocating. I'm heading back to the truck, I said, trying to keep my voice even. I had no problem with a bit of work, but this felt like too much. Raymond didn't seem to notice. He was too busy staring at the sketch in his hand, that vacant look in his eyes. I'll catch up in a bit, he muttered. I shrugged, deciding to leave him to whatever oddity he was fixated on. The rain was starting to come down harder, and by the time I got to the truck, I was soaked. The thought of starting the engine and driving away from the woods was comforting, but I couldn't do it. I knew Raymond would be pissed. So, I waited in the truck, half watching the storm, half trying to make sense of what had been going on lately. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The storm was relentless, and the feeling of isolation in the middle of nowhere was starting to creep in. Suddenly, the headlights cut through the gloom. I thought it was Raymond, but the truck that pulled up wasn't his. I watched in silence as the figure stepped out of the vehicle. It was a man, though the rain blurred his features. At first, I thought it was someone Raymond had sent to help, but there was something about the way he moved, his slow, deliberate steps, as if he was trying not to make a sound. I couldn't explain it, but it put me on edge. I figured it was a local, but why hadn't Raymond mentioned him? I waited, frozen. The man didn't seem to notice me. He walked toward the cabin, a small, dilapidated structure we had taken shelter in during breaks. But something wasn't right. There was no reason for him to go that way. Raymond should have been the one there, not some stranger. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to ignore the cold sweat that was forming on the back of my neck. Maybe I was being paranoid. I decided to go after him to at least ask if he needed help or something. When I reached the cabin, the door was slightly open. The man had disappeared inside. I didn't hear anything at first, but the silence felt wrong. Too heavy. The rain pounded against the roof, and I was just about to push the door open when I heard something. A cough. A quiet, almost imperceptible sound. My heart raced, but I didn't turn back. I pushed the door open. Inside, there was no one, just Raymond, slumped in one of the chairs. His eyes were wide, and there was a look of terror on his face I had never seen before. He looked like he had seen something that had broken him, completely shattered him. His hands were shaking as he clutched his notebook, scribbling something in it. I couldn't make sense of what he had written, but I knew something wasn't right. The man I had seen outside, the stranger, was gone. I didn't know where, but I didn't care to find out. Raymond's expression was enough to make me freeze where I stood. I hadn't seen him like this, ever. He looked at me like he didn't recognize me. "Get out," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. It was a command, but there was no power behind it. Just panic. "You don't understand. You can't stay here." The next few hours felt like a blur. Raymond didn't want to leave. He insisted that we were on the verge of something big, something important, but that we were also being watched. The way he spoke made it sound like he was being hunted, like there was something much darker going on than I could understand. I knew we needed to leave to get back to civilization, but Raymond wouldn't budge. He was terrified, and that fear was starting to grip me, too. The rest of the night passed in a haze of rain, half-delirious sleep, and an overwhelming sense of dread. In the early morning hours, I knew we had to leave. We packed up and made our way back to the truck. Raymond barely spoke the entire time. The woods, once so expansive, felt more like a prison. By the time we hit the main road, the storm had finally begun to subside. The land behind us seemed as vast and empty as it had before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something out there was watching us. As we drove away, I couldn't help but wonder, had we been followed? Was there really someone out there in those woods? Or had Raymond's mind finally cracked? I looked at him one last time. His eyes were still wide, his knuckles white from gripping the seat, his face pale. We never talked about what happened that night. When we got back, he was distant, buried in work, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew we had been close to something terrible. And I knew one thing for sure, I'd never set foot on that land again. It was a cold night when we got the call. A remote property deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, had been flagged as the location of a suspected drug operation. It wasn't just some small-time dealer cutting product in a basement. We were talking large-scale manufacturing, a distribution point for the entire region. The kind of place that didn't just have a few guys with handguns. The kind of place where people went missing if they got too close. I had been in law enforcement for over a decade. I had seen what people were capable of. I had seen the worst parts of human nature, the kind of evil that couldn't be reasoned with. I knew that places like this didn't run without bloodshed. They didn't operate without a few unmarked graves in the woods. The briefing was short and to the point. A property sitting over 30 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by dense forest. No electricity running from the grid, no landlines, satellite phones at best. Our department had been tipped off about heavy activity in and out of the area. Cargo vans making trips at odd hours, a few missing persons who were last seen heading that way, and a local hunter who found tire tracks deep in the woods where there shouldn't have been any. The Bureau had been keeping an eye on it for weeks, gathering intel, and they finally gave us the green light. The plan was simple: get in fast, hit them hard, secure the site. But I knew better. Plans fell apart the second the first shot was fired. We moved in before dawn. It was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that clung to your skin no matter how many layers you wore. The wind cut through the trees, carrying the sound of the leaves rustling, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. We had parked the SUVs a good 2 miles from the target location, moving in on foot to avoid detection. The forest was thick, the kind that swallowed up sound and light. Our flashlights stayed off. Only the faint glow of the moon and our night vision guided us. I could hear my own breathing in my headset, steady but slow. The weight of my rifle was familiar in my hands, comforting in a way that only a weapon could be when you knew you might have to use it. We crept closer, fanning out into our assigned positions. The property was in a clearing, a long, low building with a few smaller outbuildings scattered around. There were no lights, but we could see movement. Shadowy figures passing behind the windows, trucks parked outside, their beds loaded with crates. Then came the signal. The breach was fast. Explosive entry through the main door, smoke and splinters flying as we flooded in. Shouts, the sound of bodies moving, the sharp crack of gunfire. I moved in with my team, sweeping the first room, clearing corners. A man lunged from the shadows, something in his hand. I fired before I even had time to think. He dropped. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, blood, sweat. The sounds of struggle, of men fighting for their lives. I saw one of our guys go down, blood spraying across the floor as a shotgun blast caught him in the side. We pushed forward, deeper into the building. The layout was strange. Winding hallways that led to reinforced doors, rooms with heavy-duty locks, a lab filled with chemical barrels and industrial equipment. This wasn't just a drug den. This was a full-blown operation. We had expected resistance, but nothing like this. These guys weren't just criminals. They were trained. They moved with precision, coordinating their attacks. Someone had tipped them off. I took cover as a spray of bullets tore through the doorway, with splintered debris flying. My hands were steady as I returned fire, my shots finding their marks. Another body hit the ground. The radio was a mess of voices, orders being shouted, calls for medics. We were losing too many men. I pushed forward, breaking off from my team to clear a side room. The second I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. It was small, barely furnished. A cot in the corner, a bucket, a chain bolted to the floor, and in the corner a figure. Thin, pale, eyes wide with terror. A woman. She flinched as I stepped closer, her wrists raw from the cuffs that had held her. Her clothes were torn, her face bruised. She wasn't just a hostage. She was a prisoner. I reached for my radio, but before I could speak, the gunfire outside roared back to life. The building shook with the force of an explosion. Smoke poured through the doorway, thick and choking. I grabbed the woman, pulling her to her feet. She was weak, barely able to stand. I half carried, half dragged her through the building, my heart hammering against my ribs. Outside, the fight wasn't over. The remaining gunmen were making a run for it, retreating into the woods. A few of them were cut down before they made it to the tree line, but not all. I handed the woman off to one of the medics before moving to secure the perimeter. The forest was dark, swallowing up the figures that disappeared into it. We weren't going to catch them all. Not tonight. By the time the sun began to rise, the scene was a mess. Bodies, blood, shell casings littering the ground. The lab was in ruins, its equipment destroyed. The air still smelled like burning chemicals. We had taken the place down, but it didn't feel like a victory. We had lost too many good men. Too many had gotten away. And I knew, standing there in the cold morning light, that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I had been driving for hours. The road stretched out ahead of me, a narrow strip of cracked asphalt surrounded by an endless sea of dry, empty land. No houses, no buildings.
No streetlights.
Just the occasional twisted fence post or rusted-out car husk sinking into the dirt. I was somewhere in Texas or maybe New Mexico. I honestly wasn't sure anymore. My GPS had given up on me miles ago, and my phone had been out of service for even longer. The last town I'd passed through had been nothing more than a gas station, a diner, and a handful of boarded-up houses. That had been almost an hour ago. I wasn't worried at first. I had plenty of gas, plenty of snacks, and plenty of time. I was supposed to be meeting an old friend in Arizona, and I had taken the back roads to avoid the long, dull stretches of the interstate. It had seemed like a good idea at the time. I wanted the open road, the quiet, the feeling of being completely alone with nothing but my music and my thoughts. Now I was starting to regret it. The sun was getting low, dipping toward the horizon, and the temperature was dropping fast. I was used to the desert heat, but out here, once the sun started going down, it got cold in a way that sank into your bones. My jacket was in the back seat, but I didn't want to pull over to grab it. I just wanted to find a town, a gas station, anything. Then I saw the sign. It was old and sun-bleached, the paint almost completely faded, but I could still make out the word motel in big, blocky letters. There was no arrow, no distance listed, just motel. It was something, at least. A few miles later, I spotted a turnoff. The road leading away from the highway was even worse than the one I'd been driving on. The pavement was cracked, crumbling, overtaken by weeds in some places. My car's tires crunched over loose gravel and broken asphalt as I turned onto it. I had no idea what I was expecting. The place wasn't much. The motel sat on the edge of what looked like an abandoned truck stop. There was a main building, probably an office, and a long row of rooms with their doors facing the parking lot. Only 2 or 3 looked occupied. The neon sign out front flickered weakly, struggling to spell out vacancy. There were no other cars around. I parked near the office and shut off the engine. The silence that followed was unnerving. I hadn't realized how much I had come to rely on the background noise of the highway, the hum of the tires on the road, the faint buzz of the radio, the occasional gust of wind against the windows. Now, all I could hear was the faint creaking of the motel sign as it swayed in the breeze. I stepped out of the car and stretched, trying to shake off the stiffness from driving so long. The air smelled dry and metallic, like dust and old rust. The office door was locked. There was no bell, no sign, nothing. I knocked, waited, no answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I was about to give up when I noticed a small, handwritten note taped to the window. Rooms, $30 cash. Pick a key. Pay in the morning. Asterisk, asterisk, I looked down. A dusty wooden box sat on a folding table beneath the window. Inside were a handful of room keys, each one attached to an old plastic tag with a room number written on it. This was strange. I had stayed in some rundown motels before, but I had never seen anything like this. It was too trusting, too weird, but I was tired. I wasn't about to get back on the road and keep driving through the middle of nowhere in the dark. I took a key room 7, then grabbed my bag from the car. The room was about what I expected. Small, outdated, and musty. The carpet was old and stained. The wallpaper was peeling in places, and the bedspread was an ugly shade of brown with a pattern that looked like it belonged in a truck stop from the 1970s. But it was a bed. It was a roof over my head for the night. I locked the door behind me, slid the deadbolt into place, and set my bag down on the rickety chair by the window. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock. Not at my door, at one of the other rooms. I froze, listening. Another knock, then silence. I moved to the window and peered through the thin curtains. Nothing. Just the empty parking lot and the other rooms, all dark except for one, room 3. A dim light leaked from the gap beneath the door. I watched for a long time, waiting to see if someone would step outside. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself I was just tired, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. I turned off the light, kicked off my boots, and lay down on the bed. Then the knocking started again. Soft. Slow. This time it was closer. I sat up, heart pounding. Another knock, right outside my door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited. The knocking stopped. I counted to 10, then 20, then 30. Silence. I stood up slowly, careful not to make a sound, and moved back to the window. I pulled the curtain back just enough to see outside. A figure stood in the parking lot. Tall, thin, standing perfectly still, facing my room. They weren't moving. They weren't doing anything, just standing there. I let the curtain fall back into place, my heart hammering. I reached for my phone. Still no service. I thought about opening the door, calling out, but something in my gut told me not to. I waited. Minutes passed. When I finally got the nerve to check the window again, the figure was gone. The parking lot was empty. I barely slept that night. Every creak, every shift in the wind made my skin crawl. I stayed up, listening, waiting for the knocking to come back. It never did. By the time the sun started creeping over the horizon, I had already packed my bag and was ready to go. I stepped outside into the cold morning air, my breath visible in the dim light. The motel looked the same as it had the night before. Empty, lifeless. But something was wrong. The wooden box was gone.
No keys.
No note, like it had never been there at all. I didn't bother trying to pay. I got in my car, started the engine, and left without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, almost 2 hours later. When I finally pulled into a gas station and told the clerk where I had stayed the night before, he just stared at me wide-eyed. "That place?" he said, shaking his head. "That motel shut down years ago." I had been looking forward to this trip for months. I needed a break from everything, from the noise, the constant buzz of city life. All I wanted was peace and solitude, even if it meant being completely alone in the middle of nowhere. The plan was simple: set up camp, enjoy the silence, and clear my head. Montana was perfect for that. I chose a spot deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town. It was the kind of place where, if something went wrong, no one would know for hours, maybe even days. But that was exactly what I was after. No distractions, just me and the trees. I arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. The drive had been longer than I anticipated, but the weather was perfect. The sun was still high, casting long shadows over the winding dirt road. I felt a wave of relief as I turned off the engine and got out of the truck. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine filled my lungs. It was exactly as I had imagined. I grabbed my gear from the back: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a few tools, and started walking toward the spot I had scouted on the map. It took me about an hour to find the clearing, a small, almost perfect patch of flat ground nestled between a cluster of thick trees. A creek ran nearby, its sound soothing and constant. I figured I'd set up camp by the water, a short walk to a fire pit I'd read about in a local guidebook. This was the life I wanted, just me, the forest, and a sense of peace that could only come from isolation. As I started setting up the tent, I heard the first odd thing. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, a low, throaty sound, like something was brushing against the trees in the distance. I stopped and listened, but there was nothing. The air was still, just the occasional rustle of leaves. I shook it off. Animals, I thought, maybe a deer or a bear moving through the underbrush. Nothing to worry about. Still, a little voice in the back of my head told me to be cautious. The sun began to dip lower, casting everything in that warm golden light. The shadows stretched longer, and the forest started to take on a different character. I finished setting up camp just as the first chill of the evening crept in. I gathered some firewood and started a small campfire. The flames crackled and danced, offering a flicker of warmth as the temperature dropped quickly. The quiet was almost overwhelming. I was alone. There was no sound except for the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. As night settled in, the forest felt like it was watching me, its every movement slow and deliberate. I felt the silence in my bones, deep and all-encompassing. That was the thing about being in the middle of nowhere. Everything felt more intense. Even the smallest noise seemed to echo. I ate my dinner, just some canned beans and dried meat, then sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The sound of the creek was the only thing that seemed normal. But as the night wore on, I started to hear something else. A soft rustling from deeper in the woods. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the usual night sounds. This was something different, something deliberate. I stood up, scanning the shadows between the trees. Nothing, no movement.
Nos chaps.
It was the kind of sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I told myself it was just my imagination. A lot of people felt the same way when they were out here. The vastness of it, the feeling that you were just a speck in a world that didn't care about you, it could make anyone's mind play tricks. But the sound came again, louder this time, closer. I grabbed the flashlight I had tucked into my jacket pocket and shone it toward the woods, cutting through the darkness. The beam swept over the trees and underbrush. For a split second, I thought I saw something move, something large moving quickly between the shadows. I froze, staring into the dark. But then, just as quickly, the moment passed. I walked back to the fire and sat down, trying to steady my breathing. It was just an animal. That's all it was. But still, that feeling nagged at me, like I wasn't alone. Like something or someone was out there watching. The night dragged on. I sat there, staring into the fire, trying to ignore the sounds from the woods. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into my tent, where I zipped up the flap and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. The sounds outside didn't stop. I could hear footsteps now, slow and deliberate, moving just outside the range of the firelight. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. I knew it. My heart raced in my chest, but I didn't dare move. Couldn't. The fear was too thick. I lay there in the dark, wide awake, listening. The footsteps stopped, and then I heard something else. A voice, faint, low, almost like a whisper. I told myself it was the wind again, but this time it didn't feel like the wind. Felt wrong. I held my breath and waited. The seconds stretched into minutes. My mind played tricks, filling the silence with imagined sounds. But then, something heavy thudded against the side of the tent. I jolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. My flashlight was on the ground, just out of reach, but I didn't dare move. The thud came again, louder this time, and then a scratch, something scraping across the fabric of the tent. I waited for what felt like forever, but nothing else happened. Whatever it was outside, it was gone. But I knew it was still out there. I could feel it. I grabbed the flashlight and turned it on, shining the beam out through the mesh of the tent. The forest was silent again, the trees still, the air heavy. Nothing, no movement, nothing to explain what had happened. I lay back down, trying to calm my breathing. My mind raced, but there was no way I was going to get any sleep. I had to make it through the night. I just needed to get through until morning. That was the only thing that mattered. Dawn finally came. The first rays of light pierced through the trees, casting everything in a pale, soft glow. I waited until I could see clearly before I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The forest was as it had been the day before, calm and serene. But there were signs. Footprints in the dirt near the fire pit. Deep, heavy prints, almost like boots. And something else, scratches along the base of a nearby tree, like something had been dragged against it. I packed up my camp quickly. My nerves were shot, but I had to get out of there. The feeling that I wasn't alone never left me. I could almost hear someone walking behind me as I hurried to gather my things, looking over my shoulder every few seconds. But there was nothing but trees and the sound of the creek. I left the forest and drove back toward civilization, but the unease didn't fade. I kept thinking about what had happened, what had almost happened. Whoever or whatever had been out there was still on my mind. But by the time I reached the nearest town, I told myself it had to have been some kind of wild animal or even a hiker passing through. It didn't matter. The forest had been too quiet for too long. Whatever it was, whatever had been watching me, was gone. But the feeling stayed with me. Even now, as I drive through the winding roads of Montana, I keep thinking about the quiet footsteps in the dark, the sense that someone was waiting, just out of sight. I never did go back to that spot, but that night in the woods stays with me. And every now and then, when I'm deep in the forest or miles away from the nearest road, I hear that same rustling sound in the trees. And I remember there are things out there, things that watch and wait. But I've learned to be more careful.